Aristotle created 3 criteria to know when a discussion is worth it. Machiavelli discovered the political cost of each debate. Sun Tzu taught how to win without fighting, and they all reached the same conclusion. Superior men don't waste energy proving the obvious to those who cannot see. If you still think you need to counter every provocation and win every argument to be respected, you're following the playbook of the insecure. Today you'll learn the difference between strength and reaction, between confidence and the need for approval. Have you noticed how certain people seem immune to provocations? How they observe heated discussions with an almost disturbing calm? It's not indifference, it's not arrogance. It's something much deeper. It's the application of criteria that most people never learned. Criteria that decide when it's worth spending mental energy and when it's better to simply observe the chaos from afar. Most people live reacting. Someone questions their competence, they defend themselves. Someone provokes, they attack back. Someone disagrees, they feel they need to prove they're right. This pattern reveals something about character. Insecurity disguised as firmness. Because those who truly know what they're capable of don't feel the need to constantly prove it. Aristotle spent years observing debates in the Athenian agora. He saw brilliant men waste hours trying to convince people who would never change their minds. He saw politicians burn social capital in irrelevant discussions, and he realized there was a pattern in debates that truly mattered versus those that were just noise. His discovery was revolutionary. It wasn't about the topic of discussion, but about 3 elements that determined whether that moment was worth the energy investment. First element, the audience needed real capacity to understand the argument. Second, the topic needed practical relevance to the lives of those involved. Third, the context needed to allow real perspective change. When any of these elements was absent, Aristotle knew that continuing was wasteful. It didn't matter how right he was. It didn't matter how important the subject was to him. If the structure couldn't support real change, arguing became just intellectual masturbation, and superior men don't confuse personal satisfaction with effective results. People who know these criteria watch 90% of daily discussions like watching a theater play. Interesting, sometimes entertaining, but clearly performance. Because they know how to recognize when they're facing someone arguing to feel better, not to solve something. The economy of conflict works mercilessly. Machiavelli didn't need to theorize about this, he just had to observe 15 years of Italian politics to see the pattern repeat. Powerful princes lost influence by fighting for the wrong reasons. Smart men were manipulated into spending energy on irrelevant conflicts, while their rivals advanced in silence. Every discussion you choose to engage in has an invisible political price. Every time you argue, you spend 3 types of social capital. First, attention capital. People have a limit to how much conflict they can absorb from one source. Second, credibility capital. With each discussion lost or poorly conducted, you become less convincing in the next ones. Third, relationship capital. Even when you win, the other side remembers the emotional experience, not your reason. Machiavelli saw brilliant politicians become irrelevant because they didn't know how to choose their battles. They were right in 90% of the discussions they engaged in, but lost the war by spending ammunition where there was no real strategic objective. Like generals who win every skirmish, but lose the campaign from exhaustion. The question Machiavelli asked before any confrontation was simple: what do I gain if I convince this person? If the answer was vague or emotional, he knew it wasn't a battle to fight. Because powerful men don't fight for personal satisfaction, they fight for concrete results. People who master this Machiavellian logic have a devastating advantage. While others wear themselves out in useless discussions, they preserve energy for moments that truly matter. When they finally choose to speak, everyone pays attention, because they know it's not impulse, it's strategy. And this economy of conflict reveals something even deeper about social hierarchies. Those who can choose when to fight are always above those who need to react to everything. Predictable behaviors generate strategic vulnerability. Sun Tzu understood this through a fundamental principle. When you always respond to provocations, you become easy to manipulate, easy to tire, easy to defeat. Because intelligent enemies study your reaction patterns, Sun Tzu's genius was in completely inverting this logic. While conventional generals reacted immediately to every challenge, He created a system based on strategic patience. He didn't respond because he was collecting information. Each ignored provocation forced the enemy to reveal more about their true capabilities. His concept of winning without fighting wasn't passivity. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation. He understood that impulsive people always show their cards when they can't provoke a reaction. They get frustrated, make mistakes, reveal weaknesses they were trying to hide. Social pressure to respond was intense, even in ancient China. Officers questioned commanders who didn't react immediately. Soldiers whispered about possible cowardice. But Sun Tzu had calculated something others didn't see: the cost of maintaining appearances versus the benefit of accumulating real advantage. While enemies spent energy on theatrical provocations, his troops rested, prepared, studied. When he finally chose the moment to act, he knew the tactics, numbers, routes, schedules of the adversary. The battle was decided before it began. This principle reveals something profound about psychological power. Those who need to react are always at a disadvantage because they operate on time chosen by the provocateur. Those who can choose when and how to respond control the entire dynamic of conflict. This is the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is automatic, emotional, predictable. Response is calculated, strategic, at the moment chosen by you. Sun Tzu realized that supreme military skill wasn't winning all battles, but creating conditions where victory was inevitable before even fighting. People who understand this principle operate completely differently in conflicts. They don't ignore provocations out of fear or passivity. They ignore because they know that reacting on the provocateur's time is fighting at a disadvantage. They prefer to choose the terrain, the moment, and the conditions, and when they finally act, the result was already decided. This timing control reveals something even more powerful than military strategy. It reveals mastery over one's own emotions in pressure situations. Emotional autonomy is the true marker of personal superiority. Epictetus reached this conclusion through direct experience with the complete absence of external control. For decades he lived as a slave in Rome, property of Epictetus, a freedman who worked for Nero. Epictetus couldn't choose where to live, what to eat, how to dress, who to talk to. He had no control over his own time, his own body, his own circumstances. Anyone in this situation would have reasons to live in constant revolt. But this extreme experience led him to a revolutionary discovery. He realized there were two fundamental categories in human experience: things that depend entirely on us and things that don't depend on us at all, and that our inner freedom was completely linked to focusing only on the first category. Others could control his body, but they couldn't control how he interpreted events. They could force him to obey orders, but they couldn't force him to feel diminished by obedience. They could limit him physically, but they couldn't limit his thoughts. The mind remained free territory, even when everything else was under someone else's domain. This perception became revolutionary when applied to everyday situations. Every time you feel obligated to respond to a provocation, you're giving control of your mind to another person. You're allowing them to decide when you'll spend energy, how you'll feel, what will occupy your thoughts. Epictetus taught that reacting emotionally to others' opinions is a subtle form of voluntary slavery, because you're letting potentially less developed people dictate your internal states. It's like giving the steering wheel of your car to whoever is screaming from the back seat. People who have mastered this Epictetian lesson have an almost supernatural advantage in social interactions. They listen to criticism without being shaken, receive praise without being inflated, observe dramas without getting involved. Not because they don't care, but because they know that caring doesn't mean reacting automatically. And this emotional independence creates something unexpected: automatic respect from those who still live on the emotional roller coaster controlled by others. People with greater purpose don't have time for lesser validation. Marcus Aurelius faced this reality in a way few leaders in history experienced. Imagine waking up knowing that your decisions that day would affect millions of lives and still having to deal with senators complaining about personal privileges. The Roman Empire was literally crumbling when he assumed power. Plagues devastated cities, Germanic tribes invaded borders, the Roman economy faced severe inflation, and political corruption had reached critical levels. He spent months on military campaigns on the Danube, sleeping in tents, planning defenses against invasions that could end Western civilization. Meanwhile, in Rome, lesser politicians spent time discussing who deserved what honors. Academic philosophers debated irrelevant theories, and aristocrats got offended when they didn't receive invitations to imperial banquets. They sent letters demanding the emperor's attention for their personal problems while he was trying to save the known world. Marcus Aurelius developed what we call today perspective of scale. When you're genuinely busy with issues that matter in decades or centuries, discussions about who's right in temporary conflicts automatically become irrelevant. Not out of arrogance, but by simple mathematics of priorities. He wrote in his personal reflections something revealing. Each morning he reminded himself that irritating people would cross his path, but that they acted out of ignorance, not malice, and that spending energy educating those who weren't prepared to understand would subtract energy from greater responsibilities. This wasn't abstract philosophy. It was survival strategy for someone carrying the weight of keeping a civilization functioning. He simply couldn't afford to get involved in all the dramas others considered urgent. He had wars to win, epidemics to control, laws to create. People who understand this Marcus Aurelian logic operate on a different frequency. They listen to complaints about small problems with the same patience you'd listen to a child explaining why they don't like broccoli. Interesting, but not something that will change their important decisions. And the greater your sense of real responsibility becomes, the smaller your need to be understood by those operating on smaller scales of thought. True self-sufficiency completely dispenses with external approval. Nietzsche discovered this in the most radical way possible. Losing all social validation he had already conquered and having to rebuild his intellectual identity from scratch. During his early career years, he was the promise of German philosophy. Youngest professor ever appointed at the University of Basel, protege of great intellectuals, close friend of Richard Wagner, the most admired composer in Europe. He had recognition, prestige, a guaranteed academic future. He was on the path to becoming another respectable philosopher, repeating accepted ideas. But something deeply bothered him. He was living according to standards created by others, seeking approval from people whose values he internally questioned. Wagner had become anti-Semitic and German nationalist. The university demanded safe works that wouldn't disturb the intellectual establishment. In 1878, Nietzsche did something few have the courage to do. He broke with everything. He publicly abandoned his friendship with Wagner, criticized the foundations of German philosophy, questioned Christian values that sustained all European society. He lost friends, colleagues, academic recognition. He became ill, isolated, misunderstood. But it was exactly in this isolation that he developed his most revolutionary ideas. Without the pressure to please anyone, without the need to be accepted by institutions, he could think in a completely original way. He created concepts like the overman, the will to power, the transvaluation of values. The isolation revealed something liberating. When you stop seeking external validation, you can finally develop internal standards of excellence. You no longer need to prove your right to anyone because you yourself become the judge of your own intellectual quality. People who have achieved this Nietzschean self-sufficiency have something disturbing for those who still depend on approval. They simply don't care if you agree with them or not. Not because they're arrogant, but because they've developed internal validation systems more rigorous than any external criticism. And this creates an almost magnetic aura of power, because confidence that doesn't need confirmation is extremely rare. True power never announces itself, never justifies itself, never proves itself. Machiavelli studied princes who governed for decades versus those who lasted only a few years. There was something in the gestures, word silence of lasting leaders that communicated authority without apparent effort. A disturbing pattern emerged. The more someone tried to demonstrate power, the less power they actually possessed. Insecure princes made long speeches explaining their decisions. Weak leaders responded to every criticism publicly. Temporary rulers got involved in debates with subordinates to prove competence. Meanwhile, those who actually controlled territories and people for decades operated completely differently. Their decisions were communicated once without extensive justifications. Criticism was ignored or treated with polite indifference. Provocations simply didn't generate visible reaction. Machiavelli realized this wasn't conscious strategy in most cases. It was a natural consequence of someone who had internalized all the principles we discussed. Technical criteria for choosing conflicts, political economy of each discussion, superior timing strategy, absolute emotional control, greater purpose than smaller discussions, and self-sufficiency that dispenses with validation. When you master these 6 layers simultaneously, something interesting happens. You stop thinking about how to respond to provocations because they automatically become irrelevant. It's not a conscious decision, it's a natural process, like when you learn to drive and stop consciously thinking about each movement. The person who reached this level doesn't avoid discussions by strategy. They avoid because they genuinely don't feel the need for them. It's not a performance of superiority. It's natural expression of someone who internally resolved the insecurities that generate the need for external approval. And paradoxically, it's exactly this absence of need that generates the deepest recognition. People instinctively feel when they're facing someone who doesn't need to prove anything. They may not like it, they may feel uncomfortable, but they recognize real power when they see it. Machiavelli concluded that the true prince doesn't govern through won discussions, but through presence that dispenses with discussion. Not because they fear conflict, but because they transcended the need for it. And this transcendence is visible to anyone who still lives, trapped in the need to always be right. If you made it this far, you probably recognize that it's not just about avoiding discussions. It's about developing a way of existing in the world that doesn't depend on constant validation from others. It's about building an internal fortress so solid that external attacks become irrelevant. Now you've seen a bit of what makes this philosophy so impactful. Click on the video on the screen, you'll discover the deepest secrets that Machiavelli kept about how truly powerful people deal with declared enemies. Click now on the video on the screen.